Today we're so excited to have Professor Geurgana Savova, who is a professor and the Patricia F. Brennan Chair in the Computational Health Informatics program at Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. She's been in the AI field of NLP since 1999, when she started working on automatic speech recognition for medical dictations and language models for automatic speech recognition. She later switched to NLP of the clinical narrative during her tenure at Mayo Clinic from 2002 to 2010, and then continued after her move to Boston from 2010 onward. Her 2010 paper introducing the Apache Clinical Text and Knowledge Extraction System, CTEX, has been widely cited, and the CTEX software has been widely used in academia and industry. Professor Savova has been leading the development of two other open source tools, the DeepPhi and DeepPhi-CR, specifically geared towards the oncology domain. Professor Savova's lab is funded exclusively by NIH funding to advance NLP of the clinical narrative. She has mentored numerous mentees, now successful professionals. And last but importantly, Professor Savova and Professor El-Haddad are longtime collaborators. And so with that, we're so excited to have you here today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. And it's a great opportunity to present to all of you on what I believe is a very exciting topic that is not yet fully addressed, even in the area of large language models. So, as it was said in the introduction, I started in the AI language modeling field back in 1999, and back in that time, it was not a very popular field. So it was considered to be somewhat esoteric, and I had to explain to various people exactly what I did, because they would ask me, okay, what is language modeling? Exactly how do you apply it? And what's the usability of language models? So now fast forward to last year, I was going to the ACL conference in Toronto, Canada. And, you know, when you cross the border, they ask for the passport, and they also ask the customs people, they ask you for the purpose of your trip. And I explained, I'm going to the conference, to this conference. And they said, which conference is that? And I told them, Association of Computational Linguistics. And they were very puzzled, and they said, what is that? We don't understand what that is. And then I said, well, think about ChatGPT. And the moment I mentioned that, their eyes brightened, and they said, oh, yes, now we know what you're talking about. So throughout my career, when I started very early on, it was very difficult to explain what language models are. However, now it's a very different story. I just have to mention ChatGPT, and then people seem to understand what language models are, or at least how those language models are used. So the topic of timeline extraction, I don't believe it's a solved topic even nowadays with the large language models. And I will show you results with a variety of technologies. So before I do that, I'd like to say that I have many collaborators throughout the years on this specific topic, because it's a very complex topic, and it takes an army of researchers to actually make advances in that topic. So we started this project back in 2009, and it was funded by the National Library of Medicine. It was renewed multiple times, and the current funding just finished. So we are applying for renewal of that project. So when we started back in 2009, there was very little done in the clinical domain on temporal relation extraction. So there were not even annotated data sets, labeled data sets that you can use to actually start thinking about computational approaches for that topic. So we had to start building those data sets because you need label data sets to train models. You need them to also evaluate the methodologies that you're building. And then stepping back, why is temporality important in biomedicine? Why should we be investing the effort to solve that problem? It's because everything in medicine is temporally associated. There are so many medical events, and if we aim to understand deeply what's in the patient narrative, we have to understand the association, the temporal associations between the medical events. So, for example, in one study, we were focusing on methotrexate-induced liver toxicity. So what that means is that patients with rheumatoid arthritis, not cancer, because methotrexate is also used for cancer, are given this medication, and some of the patients develop liver toxicity, other patients do not develop that. So how do we start thinking about investigating this dichotomy of liver toxicity? You have to position the events on a timeline. You have to know when the methotrexate started. You have to know when the liver toxicity started, and then you can do all kinds of studies. In the oncology domain, you need to understand the treatment regimens. So a patient is treated with a certain treatment regimen for a certain type of cancer. The tumor profile changes, then why and in what patients does the tumor profile change? So for that, you again need the treatment timeline and the medical events associated with that patient. So there are many, many use cases where temporality is critical in biomedicine. So now stepping back, how can we break this very difficult topic into something that is computable? So how do we even start thinking about temporal relations? So the way we start thinking, we approach the problem and started thinking about temporal relations is through the prism of pairwise temporal relations. So what does that mean? So I'm giving you a very small piece of text from a clinical note. It's only 2 sentences. So in that text, we have to define temporal relations. So how do we define those temporal relations? First, we have to think about events. So the text highlighted in blue are the events. However, how do you define an event? So we had these very, very long discussions of what the definition of an event is. And we came up with this very simple definition that whatever you can position on a timeline is defined to be an event. So now thinking about this 2-sentence piece of text is annotated for events. Then once you have the events, you also have to think about temporal expressions. So the temporal expressions are any indications of temporality. So it could be dates, it could be relative temporal expressions, like 2 months ago, 2 days ago, something like that. But you have to somehow also find them computationally and then relate those time expressions or temporal expressions with the events. So the text highlighted in red are the temporal expressions. Now the pairwise relations are the relations that relate to events, like in the first example, admitted and appendectomy, or an event and a time expression, like in the second example, appendectomy, and January 12th. So this is the way we started thinking computationally about temporal relations. Pairwise relations between two events or an event and a temporal expression. So why do we think this is a good approach, computational approach? It's because it's something that is definable, that is contained, and that you can train models on. Once you have these pairwise relations, then you can build a graph that encompasses the entire text, and you can start querying the graph and building timelines. So again, thinking about temporality, you have the events, you have relations between events, but then you can also think about temporality at the course level. And that course level we define as the relation of the event to the document creation time. And that's doc time rel. So even if you don't have any temporal expressions, even if you cannot relate two events temporally, you can still provide some level of temporality associated with the event. And that's through the doc time rel. So here's an example. The surgery went well. And that's your entire text. There are no other events. There are no temporal expressions. So the best that you can do is that you can say that the surgery actually happened before the document creation time. Although it's very coarse and very broad, it still has value and it still provides some level of temporality. You can do the same with future events. You can do the same with overlapping events and before overlapping events. So even with something as simple as this, you can start creating timelines. However, in many cases, that's not sufficient, and there is more evidence in the text that you can do a very fine level temporality. So one type of temporal relation, and that's actually the most frequent in clinical text, is the contains temporal relation, or what's called narrative container. So the definition of a narrative container is that you have either a date or an event that becomes an anchor to many other events. And then that anchor, in a way, is the bucket, the container that holds all the other events. So in this very simple sentence, we have December 16 as being the anchor, because December 16 contains the surgery and it also contains the removal. And the relations, then you can break the container into pairwise relations, and those links between the container and the event will be defined as contains temporal relation. So thinking about events, time expressions, pairwise relations, and the types of temporal relations, now we have to build label data that we can use for training models and also evaluation. As I said, back in 2009, when we started the project, there was nothing in the clinical domain that was annotated that could be used as label data. So we had to start from scratch, and we created the time corpus. Time stands for temporal histories of your medical events, and it consists of 1,200 clinical pathology, radiology notes for patients with colon and brain cancer. We use that corpus for semi-eval shared tasks as well, and I'm going to show you some of the results. And we annotated that corpus for events. However, not only clinical events, we annotated for all types of events, clinical events, as well as general events, all types of relations, and also co-reference and bridging relations. In 2020, we created Time Plus, because when we analyzed the annotations in the first edition of Time, we noticed that there was another type of relation that we needed to refine and add to that corpus, and specifically that was the noted on relation. So here are some statistics for the Time Plus corpus. So this is the number of documents, time expressions, events, and T-links spread across colon cancer, brain cancer, and then trained, deaf, and test sets. And I'm showing only the numbers for the contains relation, because as I said, that's probably 80% of the data. That's the most frequent type of relation. So going forward, it took us probably 2 years to actually define computationally the task, the definition of event, and then the type of temporal relations, the novel definition, the novel introduction of a narrative container, and the contains relation. So then we started thinking about methods. And I'm going to show you the evolution of the methods. And in a way, this is the evolution of the field of natural language processing going through today with the large language models. So back in 2012, the state-of-the-art model were feature-based models, and support vector machines was the one that actually produced the best results. So when we started back then, you see that the results, the baseline results for the container relation is very low. So that's 2.6 F1 baseline result back in 2012. We organized a task, and the best result back then was 0.18. So these were very, very low results for the temporal relations. However, if you pay attention to the dog time rel, the results were very good. So with classic support vector machines, at that time, we could get course level temporality in terms of dog time rel fairly reliably. So we approached human inter-annotator agreement. However, the other types of temporal relations, the very fine types of temporal relations, were a challenge. So now moving forward, still back in the days of feature-rich methods, we were beginning to think about what other features we can introduce to actually boost the performance of the support vector machines. And at that time, the syntactic tree kernels, we thought of the syntactic tree kernels as one way of improving the performance of the temporal relation parser. So why syntactic tree kernels? The reason is that when we did some analysis on the syntactic trees and the temporal relations, we noticed that there is a correlation between the events, the temporal relations, and the syntactic path. So because of that analysis, we spent significant amount of time designing the tree kernels and experimenting with them. And that paid off because the performance now increased to 0.59 F1 score. We also cleaned up a lot of the data, and we also created some additional data using UMLS event expansion. Then 2016, now slowly we are moving into the deep learning area. And at that time, it's the convolutional neural networks and its syntactic embeddings as well, and also embeddings, word embeddings, but they're the word embeddings that are no longer used. Those were the glove and the word-to-vec embeddings. So we started experimenting with the neural methods and comparing the neural methods with the support vector machines. But as you can see back then, we didn't see much difference between convolutional CNNs, convolutional neural networks, the way we were using them, and the feature-based support vector machine. However, thinking philosophically about this, although there isn't a gain with the neural approaches, still there is a gain in efficiency because you don't have to design the features that go into the feature-based support vector machines. You don't have to design them. You don't have to build extractors to get these features. So in a way, computationally, it's a cheaper approach to use neural networks. Then we started thinking about representations. So neural methods, they're not giving us gains. However, they're computationally cheaper. So how can we improve the representations, the embeddings that actually go into the CNN? And we started thinking about time expression specifically, because there are so many variations of the time expression, they're not unique. We thought of collapsing the time expressions into one representation called the date. Because when you collapse all the time expressions into one representation, you collapse the probability mass, you have then a better embedding with probably stronger predictability that goes into the model. So this is what we experimented with, and actually that did bring some improvements, a tiny improvement, and also we moved away from the CNNs to the LSTMs. So now the results are 0.63 F1, and we also started working on cross-domain applications, so moving from colon cancer to brain cancer. So this result, if you remember back in 2012, we started with F1 of 0.18. And now this is 2018, if I remember correctly. So now the result is 0.63. So we are moving the needle, but still we need to move the needle to at least 0.75 F1. And that's based on our discussions with the NCI, where we can think of actually starting using these models in real applications. So how can we move the needle? And back in 2018, now we are in the attention is all you need error. And the first BERT models, and BERT is, as you know, it's an encoder model. And then T5 came along, and T5 is an encoder-decoder architecture. So we started experimenting with all of them. So initially it was the encoder module, BERT, and we again moved the needle. So now this is a significant improvement from 0.63 with the LSTM to 0.68 with BERT. And also there, we improved the results on cross-domain applications. Then we started thinking about ensembling, because in the machine learning community, there is a lot of evidence that if you start ensembling models that cover various sides of very complex problems, you're probably going to improve the overall performance of the model. However, the way we assembled our models didn't bring much significant improvement. Actually, it's a little bit of degradation because the results dropped slightly to 0.66. So now I want to give you the results per type of temporal relation. So the overall result so far, so now this is the overall result, it's not only for one type of relation, is 0.632. Moving to the most frequent relations, contains, as I mentioned, is the most frequent one. The result now is 0.75. The noted on relation, which is the second most frequent, is very close to 0.75. And overlap, which is the third frequent, the overall is 0.44. However, the minority class results are fairly low. So we still have significant challenge with the minority classes, and those are the temporal relations of type B4, begins on and ends on. So the big takeaway is that fine-tuning encoder-based models for this specific task works the best. However, the issue with the minority classes is still not a solved problem. So we have to start thinking about how we can generate more instances in a smart way for the minority classes, so that we can bring the results of the minority classes to where the results for the majority classes are. And now moving into the large language models. So it's a big question of whether we can use the large language models for the task of the temporal relation extraction and also timeline creation. So I'm giving you a very basic representation of a comparison between a goal timeline, the output of Llama 2 70 billion parameters, and ChatGPT. So you don't have to read this, you just have to pay attention at the gaps. So you see the goal timeline is fairly dense, and when you move to Llama 2 and ChatGPT, you see that there are quite a few gaps, blank rows that are not populated with any type of relation. So this is very curious, and we pose the question as to what extent you can use the state-of-the-art autoregressive, decoder-only, large language models for this specific task. And I'm emphasizing autoregressive, decoder-only because these are the most popular models these days. So when you look at Llama 2, the GPT models, Mistral, Mixtral, all of them are decoder only. And the community has moved to decoder only models. So to answer that question in a way, we expanded the task to not only the pairwise temporal relation task, but also to the task of creating a timeline given all the documents for the patient that exist in the EMR. So pairwise relations are the building blocks of that task. However, the real end user interest is more on the timeline creation. So this is now the task. The task is create the timeline of the chemotherapy treatments for a patient with cancer. And this is an example of a timeline for one patient. So there are many treatments with various chemotherapy agents. And if you follow the treatment, you can then create the regimen treatment timeline. So we pose that question: in the era of large language models, can we build the timeline for chemotherapy treatments given the entire EMR of a patient with cancer? So you don't prune by only oncology nodes. You don't prune, let's say, by treatment nodes. You're given everything that the patient has, and you're asked to create the timeline of the treatments. So we organized a shared task, and this is the shared task. It's collocated with the NAACL conference, this year's NAACL conference in Mexico City. And we just finished the shared task, and I'm going to show you results that answer some of our research questions. So this is the timeline of the task. We opened the registration in January, and as I said, we just closed the shared task. The data is provided by UPMC, and it's de-identified for everything except the dates, because the dates are very important. And it consists, as I said, of all types of nodes, from the patient EMR, radiology reports, pathology, clinical nodes, oncology, discharge, progress, ER nodes, all kinds of nodes. The data is divided into two parts: the unlabeled data, which has about 60,000 patients with breast and ovarian cancer, and about 16,000 patients with melanoma. So to give you a perspective, this unlabeled data set is at least double the size of the MIMIC data, because the MIMIC data has about 30,000 ICU patients, 35,000. So this is a much bigger data set of unlabeled data that potentially can be used to pre-train a model or to continue train a model. Then a subset of the unlabeled data, we actually manually annotated for pairwise relations and the final timeline, chemotherapy timeline. And this is the distribution across the train and the dev sets across the ovarian, breast, and melanoma and skin cancers. So as you can see, there is plenty of data points that can be used to either train, fine-tune a model, prompt a model, whatever you want to experiment with. So definitely there is power in this data, so we don't worry that what we provide to the community as a label data set is underpowered. And we define two tasks. Subtask 1 is when you assume perfect event and time expression recognition, meaning that we provide the gold annotations for the events and the time expressions. And the goal is then to run some temporality on top of them and create the timeline. The time expressions, by the way, they need to be normalized to the ISO standard. Subtask 2 is an end-to-end system. So you're given just text of the nodes, you don't use any of the gold annotations, and then you're asked to create the timeline for that patient. Any questions so far?
I'm not seeing anything in the chat. It looks like you're good to continue.
Okay, very good. So I'm going to show you this slide twice because it's a very interesting slide. So I'm showing it to you before I show you the results, and then I'll show it to you again after I show you the results. We had 30 teams, 30 plus teams requesting the data, going through the GUA process, and actually getting the data. We ended up with, if I remember, about 25 submissions for subtask 1 and about a dozen submissions for subtask 2. So this table summarizes the approaches used by the teams. I'm trying to move the controls, sorry. So as you can see, there are a variety of approaches. There is a simple logistic regression. There is a soft voting classifier. There are encoder-only models and fine-tuning. So PubMed BERT is an encoder-only. BioLM is also an encoder-only. However, there are also seq-to-seq models, FLAN-T5 and BART large. And then there are the decoder-only autoregressive models. So you see models like Llama2, Mistral, Meditron, Mixtro, OpenChat 3.5. So there is a variety of approaches that the teams actually use for this task. These are the results for subtask 1. We, the organizers, we provided a baseline system. So at the very bottom, you see the result for the baseline. And it's a very strong baseline system. The baseline system is actually fine-tuned PubMed BERT system. Then if you look at the results of the participants, you'll notice that there's only one team that actually beat the baseline system. And overall, the top teams use some sort of fine-tuning an encoder-only model. The bottom teams, on the other hand, they use prompting strategies. And the gap between prompting large language models, and they experimented with a few, or what I consider the state of the art of the open LLMs, the Llama 2, Mistral, and Mixtral. The gap between prompting the best open LLMs and fine-tuning an encoder-only model is fairly large. It's 0.5 F1. So we still have to see the papers of the teams to understand the details of their methodologies. So the papers, we are waiting for the camera-ready copies of the papers, and they will be published in the proceedings. But looking at the high-level conclusions from these results, it seems that still for this very sophisticated, complex task of timeline extraction, temporality, still the fine-tuning approach works much better than trusting a prompting methodology for the large language models. So this is subtask 1. And just to remind you, this is the task where you get the goal events and the goal temporal expressions, and then from there on, you create the timelines. So now moving to the task, to subtask 2.
I have a question.
Yes.
Sorry. So when you say like fine-tuning, do you have an idea of how many examples or how large the fine-tuning data set was? Was it something that only required a couple of samples or many samples?
Okay, so yeah, this is the fine-tuning. So they use the train set to fine-tune. So this is
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So everyone uses the same test fine-tuning train set.
Yes, yes, because this is the only label data, and maybe for the final submission, I have to see their papers, but maybe they combine the train and the dev to actually boost the model, and then they applied it to the test set because they didn't have access to the test set, so they could have joined the two.
Were they allowed to augment, the training data sets with other data sets they had, or was it only the ones that were in the competition?
Yes, they were allowed. Yes, yes. And as I said, I want to see the papers, so I suspect that some of them probably use the unlabeled data. So we had 57,530 patients with breast and ovarian, and 15,009 for 6 patients with melanoma that are unlabeled data. So I'm thinking that maybe some of them could have continued train the model and then fine-tuned on top of the continued training.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yep. But I have to see the papers, so. Now, moving to the end-to-end system, subtask 2, which is the end-to-end system. And actually, this is the realistic scenario. So you don't have any gold annotations, you just have models and apply to unseen eyes-off data. So now the results, they are lower. So just to show you again, the top result for when you have the goal events and time expressions, that's 0.9. And now it's 0.7. So there is a drop in the performance, and which tells us that event and time expression recognition is still not a solved problem, surprisingly. The baseline system, the F1 is 0.58, and the top systems beat the baseline system by a wide margin. Again, the top systems use fine-tuning models, while the bottom ones are prompting strategies. As I keep saying, I don't know exactly what prompting strategies they use. I have to read their papers when they become available, because there are so many ways that you can prompt models that it's really dependent on how the prompts were constructed. And also there are machine learning approaches for prompting. So instead of a human going and typing various queries, so I don't know whether they use the machine learning approach for prompts or whether they use the human and experimented with various types of prompts. So now this answers to an extent the research question that we posed. In the era of large language models, in the era of dominance of a decoder autoregressive models, what is the best strategy for approaching a very complex task as the temporal relation extraction and timeline creation? So it seems that still fine-tuning models is the better approach. And perhaps we need more experiments, more understanding of how to approach these very large language models for this task. And I guess it's only the future that will tell whether we can actually reach, with prompting, whether we can reach the performance of fine-tuned models. So I told you that I was going to show you again the slide of the methods employed by the participants in this task after you've seen the results. So here's again that slide. So the top system is this one. So they're fine-tuning a large language model, and actually they're fine-tuning a sequence-to-sequence model because FLAN, T5, and BART large, they're encoder-decoder models. The bottom ones, NYU, it's zero-shot prompting, and they're using the Mixtro 7B model. And at least with our experiments, Mixtro is gives us the best performance when we compare with Llama 2 and Mistral. The Wonder team, they're the second best. So they fine-tune the BioLM, which is an encoder-based model. One of the bottom ones, the lexicons, they're also using zero-shot. And I don't know the final result, what model the final result is with, but it's one of those very large language models. So
what so one thing I do know about the FLAN model, by the way, is that it is sort of made to be fine-tuned, or at least when it was released. And so I guess I wonder, when you're looking at across all of these other models, like, is it that you're finding a relationship between the type of architecture or sort of what it was pre-trained on and how it ended up performing on this particular task? Like, is it just that, you know, it is FLAN, like, is it just that because it's been designed to be fine-tuned, it's done well on this particular task?
Yeah, as I said, I have to see the papers to know the details of exactly what was done. So we asked the teams we had like a form with questions so that we can have this kind of table to include in the final paper, but I'm still missing the details. So I don't know whether, for example, this team, which is the top team, whether their top result is with the FLAN T5 or whether it's with BART. And if I remember correctly, FLAN was also trained on biomedical data, fine-tuned. You're absolutely right. So there is a foundation model, and that's the T5. And if I remember correctly, FLAN T5 was continued trained on biomedical data. So there is some more explicit biomedical representation, if I remember correctly. But I don't know which model actually produced the best result. And BART is just the crawl data, the common crawl data. So, yeah.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. But as I said, at the first glance, without knowing the details, fine-tuning smaller models and fine-tuning, so sequence to sequence and encoder seems to be the best. And that's kind of a hypothesis, or at least the discussion item in the community, that for information extraction tasks, models that have an encoder model, meaning you get some bidirectional representation, works better than having only the autoregressive decoder. But it's an open question, I guess. So, and I'll finish with the acknowledgement. So I started with the huge team behind this 14-year project. We are very grateful to National Institutes of Health for supporting us. And if you have any questions, feel free to email.
Thank you so much. I see we have a question from Abby.
Yes.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for your talk. In the beginning, you talked a lot about the difficulties in just creating a definition for an event and presumably training annotators to agree on the definition of an event. And I was wondering if you see inter-annotator agreement as sort of an upper bound on model performance here?
Yes, so that's a very good question. So we have all the metrics and inter-annotator agreements. So the inter-annotator agreement on events only was in the 70s. The inter-annotator agreement on the contains relation was the best, and that was close to 0.7. However, the inter-annotator agreement on the minority classes was fairly low. And when we did analysis on why that happens, it's not so much because the annotators honestly disagree. It's because there is so much information that it's very easy to actually miss temporal relations. So if you think about temporal relations, you can annotate, let me find an example. You can annotate every single pair within given text like this. So you can start this pairwise linking, and it becomes very overwhelming very fast. So when we did the analysis of the disagreements between the annotations of the annotators, we found that they're not actually disagreements, they're honest misses because of this highly cognitively taxing task. And because of that, we think that to an extent, we can use the inter-annotator agreement as the system target, however, not necessarily as the upper bound for performance, because the system can easily beat the performance of a human when the main disagreements are because of misses. So in a way, the annotations, the gold annotations, they're the joint of the two annotators, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.